Welcome to Blockchain Recorded, the podcast for the tech curious, where we talk about anything and everything related to the exponentially evolving crypto, blockchain, and Web 3.0 space. Our mission is simple: to share knowledge, facilitate discourse, and help evolve education in blockchain fundamentals, decentralization solutions, and relevant use cases for today's digital economy. We at Blockchain Recorded are not registered investment advisors and do not deal with financial or trading token elements, nor offer any licensed financial services. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, while the opinions of all parties involved are their own. I'm your host, Nina Tserar, and now let's talk blockchain. Before I introduce our guest today, I'd like to remind our listeners to follow us on Twitter, where we pre-stream each episode on Twitter Spaces the day before publishing on all major podcast platforms. For the platform list, visit our website, blockchainrecorded.com. And with us today, we have Martin Schmidt. Martin is one of the co-initiators of the Q protocol, a layer 1 blockchain that provides shared governance security for the Web3 world. Besides co-founding Q Development AG, a company focused on supporting the Q protocol, he's the founder of Postera Capital, the company behind Europe's first regulated crypto fund. And before discovering crypto, Martin has had a career at the intersection of finance and technology. Martin, welcome to Blockchain Recorded.
Hi, great to be here.
And I think I'm interchanging, again, your name. I say Martin and Martin. I apologize for that if I'm mispronouncing your name.
That is totally fine.
Yeah. Please just tell us about your background and just sort of, it's the typical question that I ask, and what led you to the world of Web3 and ultimately co-initiating Q protocol?
I got into Web3 or crypto as it was still called back then in around 2016, 2017. Was introduced by friends, colleagues, one of them, Nicholas, who is also one of the initiators behind the Q protocol. And I guess as so many of us kind of stumbled into it, I was skeptical at first. Coming from a traditional finance background, I had many questions as to the technology, whether it could work, as to the economics, how can a token without intrinsic value, accrue value, do smart contracts work, and so on and so forth. But at the same time was fascinated by it and, stumbled into it. And, the infamous rabbit hole, I guess, applied to me too. Just read a lot and, never get out again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's usually, once you're in, it's very difficult to look back. So what led you to, you actually say initiate when you say you're all initiators. This is actually the first time that we've had the title. What prompted you to co-initiate Q protocol?
We're trying to be precise with words and language, and many people say co-founder, which I think is kind of a misnomer for a protocol that's decentralized and not really belonging to any specific entity or person. So if you want, technically, the Q protocol has been initiated by a bunch of people, including myself, but the token launch was out of a Liechtenstein-based foundation, a non-profit foundation, in which I don't have a role personally. So this is why we prefer to say initiator rather than founder, because founder implies some kind of control that I, as a person, simply don't have in the protocol.
Fair enough. So that's what lies behind the title. Yes.
I guess in general in Web3, the language differs from the language we use in the corporate context sometimes. And, partially that's just buzzwording, but I think partially that's also for a good reason.
Right.
Because things are different. So we're trying to, at the places where things are really different, we're also trying to use language that really represents the facts of what we're doing and how things work in Web3 or in the decentralized world.
I think actually that's a very, very fair point. Up until now, no one has actually talked about it in this way, that as a co-founder, it implies that you own or control something. I think that's a very fresh way of looking at it and very valid.
Yeah, we're trying also to be cognizant of that within the team, within the community. Mm-hmm. Just recently, I've come across a great blog post by Rebecca Rettig, who's I believe, chief legal officer of Polygon Labs, if I'm not mistaken, who wrote pretty much the same points and pointed out the differences in language that apply to Web3 as compared to the corporate world. And I think a lot of that is actually what regulators and lawmakers get wrong. So they're trying to kind of approach the Web3 space in the same way that they approach the corporate space. And, for some aspects, I think that might be fine, but for others, it just leads in the wrong direction. So I believe that being cognizant of the language you use is quite important.
I strongly agree with that. So let's move on to actually, I should just ask this first. What is Q protocol?
The Q protocol is a decentralized protocol that intends to provide shared governance security for Web3. And breaking that down a little bit more technically, maybe, it's that the technical basis is a layer 1 blockchain based on Ethereum technology. So it's a fork of the Geth client with a set of smart contracts on top of it, plus an architecture that enables decentralized decision-making, as we say, beyond code is law, to be implemented and enforced within a decentralized context or in the decentralized world.
That's a very rich description, and we will definitely unpack all of the components, because there's the technicals, and then you just mentioned it supports governance frameworks, and then the code is beyond code is law is what I'll probably drill you a little bit more later. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of Q, it would be good to set the stage just for the concept of governance in general. So if we talk about on-chain governance, could you describe or how you see on-chain governance, the on-chain governance space, and how do you see it evolving? Maybe we talk about that in general, sort of just to set the stage for the governance space before we actually talk about Q in detail.
Taking a very high-level view,
yes.
My belief or observation is that the decentralized governance space and how we deal with on-chain governance is still very much in its infancy. So I'd like to draw a parallel to smart contract security, which is that if you compare the stage where we're at when it comes to governance security, we are really in 2016 equivalent, or 2015 equivalent even for smart contract security. So we haven't even discovered or implemented the basics in many protocols that make governance security reliable and secure and sustainable. So what you see in many protocols is that you have, I'd say pretty random voting on any types of decisions by all token holders, and not a lot of nuance when it comes to how decisions are made, what types of decisions require which type of decision by which stakeholder group. But also there is very little thought about governance security, i.e. if you have governance parameters or things that are controlled by governance within a protocol, how do you avoid those being corrupted or exploited even, either by stakeholders of the protocol itself or by outside stakeholders that might want to either capture value or just make things more difficult.
So along the lines of what you just mentioned, you talk in an article or write in an article that the main reason behind crypto exploits and hacks is the lack of proper governance. What exactly do you consider proper governance? And this is sort of a twofold question. And how does it integrate into the decentralization thesis of Web3?
Proper governance, in my view, always needs at least three elements. So first, you need a rule set which defines what the governance is, what it does, what the rules are that should be applied. Secondly, and I think this is the element that often is missing, you need a mechanism of enforcing those rules. So unless rules are enforced, they are pretty much worthless. Or even the worst case, they're counterproductive in that people think they can rely on a rule set, but in fact they don't when things go wrong. So rule sets, enforcement, and the third element that you need is a way to resolve disputes, which is particularly important when you have rules that are, as I like to say, non-deterministic, so need interpretation or do reflect some kind of intent that needs to be interpreted. So if you have those, I would say that those are the minimum criteria that you need for quote-unquote proper governance or governance that actually works. If one of them is missing, typically it's not great.
And that's where a lot of DAOs run into problems.
Yes. And the way that this ties into the general thesis or framework of decentralization is that I believe if you have a decentralized protocol with governance, i.e. there are decisions that need to be made beyond the code, so decisions that are made by token holders or by other stakeholders in the system, then if those decisions are not decentralized and cannot be enforced in a decentralized way, but rely on either centralized decision making or basically existing legal systems to be enforced, then you're kind of almost losing all the benefits of decentralization that you're looking for. So the way that I think about it is that the security of any system or protocol is always only as good as the weakest part. And often that weakest part is governance. So you may have a great protocol that works as long as it does, based on smart contracts that are immutable, that cannot be tampered with. But then you have those few elements of the protocol where really critical decisions end up being made by, 2 people, 3 people with a multisig, or token holders where you have low voter turnout and that can be easily captured or corrupted, or that are, worst of all, not even properly defined, so you don't even know what the decision making is for those elements of the protocol. So decentralized governance decisions and the security related to that, in my view, is really an essential part of the whole decentralization thesis, that if it's missing, we're limiting ourselves to just very simple protocols that can actually run purely on immutable smart contracts, which I believe there are such protocols, definitely, but they're just very limited.
Just to help our audience perhaps picture or understand more these are very abstract sort of terms that we're dancing around. Could you give us maybe a good use case of how proper governance is integrated in a DAO, for example? It's usually the most common now that we consider, or actually, or maybe not even a DAO. I'm not sure what your practice is or what your experience has been this far.
Yes, I think DAOs are a good place to start, and there are very different types of DAOs. So we can go through a couple of different DAO archetypes, if you will. So one would be a DAO that's purely, let's say, a social DAO that brings together people with a common interest, and there, for example, membership decisions could be an element that are subject to governance. And you can of course say that the DAO members decide on a one-by-one basis who's admitted and who's not. But you could also say, we want certain criteria, and those should be objective and should be enforced by the DAO, which, doesn't really work purely on a token holder voting basis, because how do you ensure that the criteria are upheld within the community other than by social pressure? So this would be one example of a purely social DAO where governance comes in, which maybe is not, as security critical, but kind of still mission critical for the DAO. Another example would be a DAO controlling a DeFi protocol. So, you have MakerDAO famously. It even has the DAO in its name. But if you look at most DeFi protocols, they are dependent on parameter setting. So let's say lending protocol, you have criteria of what's an eligible asset, what are margin requirements, what are liquidation ratios, and so on. Or a AMM, where you decide which tokens are supported by the front end. That could be another example. So in all of those cases, you have some parameters that are set. And again, those parameter settings are often done by some form of DAO or token holder voting. And in many DeFi protocols, those parameters are security critical. So meaning that if you get your hands on enough tokens, you can manipulate key parameters and exploit the DAO. This is happening, unfortunately, on a regular basis. Mango DAO was one example where that has happened, and that's a governance issue. So having poor governance or non-enforceable governance rules puts the whole DeFi protocol at risk.
So it sounds like, just in from a bird's eye view, that the automated part only gets us up to a certain point, that we need to do more. So where does Protocol Q come in with its mission and with what you were doing and its use case?
The Q protocol allows other protocols to set up their rules that are non-deterministic, i.e. they cannot be programmed in smart contracts purely, and have those rules enforced by the Q protocol. That is the core idea behind the Q protocol. So in the way that this is done is that another protocol would need to first define their own rule set. In Q, we call this a constitution, which is a term I think that's often used in DAOs or other protocols. And then the concept or the idea is that these constitutions would become a part of the Q constitution, be integrated and therefore enforced by the Q protocol. So you could have, for example, for the DeFi example that I just mentioned, you could have parameters that are defined in writing qualitatively. So you're setting bounds within those parameters, within which those parameters can be moved or determined. But then those bounds are enforced by the Q protocol. And the essence of that is bringing human decision-making into the protocol, but in a way such that the people who enforce the decisions cannot profitably exploit the parameter settings or the decision-making of the other protocols. So by sharing the governance security, you're making it more secure, which is very different from having purely a governance token that defines or controls only one protocol. So similarly, as Ethereum or other layer 1 blockchains provide shared transaction security, and it's not profitable to exploit Ethereum just to get your hands on the TVL of one specific application that sits on top of Ethereum. Similarly, the idea behind Q is that by sharing this governance security, if you want to corrupt certain parameters or certain governance decisions of protocols that use Q as a governance backbone, it would just be way too costly to corrupt the whole Q protocol just to corrupt one specific application that's using the Q governance features. Okay,
there's a lot in there that I would love to unpack. But firstly, you said a buzzword, a constitution. Just sort of taking two steps back, you point out, actually, and especially I listened to a talk that you delivered at ETH Denver, that enforcement of decisions is a critical factor, which is what you spoke of earlier, the three elements of what is important in a proper governance. When does a DAO, would you say that, for example, if we're talking about DAOs, is there a time when a DAO would need a constitution and not need a constitution? Or would you say that a constitution is needed all the time in setting up a DAO?
It's definitely not needed all of the time. I would say that many DAOs would benefit from it or do benefit from it. But there is a tendency of DAOs to pack too much into a constitution. Kind of make it more like a mission statement and a roadmap, and not think clearly or sufficiently about execution or enforcement of the rules that are in the constitution. So my general advice is that if you have things in the constitution that cannot be enforced, you should very, very cautiously think about whether it makes sense to have them in there, because it can have the opposite effect of people relying on the rules, but then finding out in hindsight that the rules are not enforceable, which then causes frustration in the best case, loss of funds in the worst case. So this element of enforcement, I think, is critical, but also maybe one step before that, things that can be programmed via immutable smart contracts, you may not need to put into a constitution, because that's why we have smart contracts for. So anything that can enforced on a quote-unquote code is law basis, it makes sense to do so. And constitution part, which goes beyond that, should be really be, in my view, reserved for those elements that cannot be coded yet.
Okay. So I noticed you frequently use the phrasing code is law. But as far as I gathered from the research that I did and listening to you and about Q, that's actually not enough. If I'm going, I hope I'm going in the right direction here. You actually tweeted that your aim is to build a system that enables decentralized rule enforcement beyond code as law. So what exactly, I mean, you've alluded to this a bit, and we've talked about this and we're dancing around this, but what exactly do you mean here? And also, I'm just more curious, just in general, or more specifically, actually, how can code as law concept go rogue? I mean, you did allude to the hacks and what can go wrong, but just maybe some specific examples.
So the term beyond code is law often causes people to, it causes strong reactions with some people.
How so?
Well, the term code is law has become kind of a battle cry for many people in crypto.
Yeah, like a mantra.
Yeah, for good reasons, because it is what differentiates crypto from the traditional financial world, I guess, that you have rules that are immutable, that you do not have to rely on traditional legal systems to have safe and secure systems that enable value transfer. And all of that is great. But I think it's often butchered in the sense that some people believe that code is law can replace law overall. And clearly, this is not how the term was intended to be used. If you read or listen to statements or publications of Lawrence Lessig, who's the Harvard professor who is credited with coming up with a term, I mean, that's clearly not what he was writing about or speaking about of the term. But it does mean that in certain areas, code can take on functionally the role that traditionally law has played in many ways. So if you have immutable smart contracts, there are certain things that you can program that provide a level of security for transactions that you couldn't have just purely on a basis without a blockchain that you would traditionally rely on in a legal system, or you would need the legal system to rely on transaction security. And these are areas where code is law makes sense. So it does functionally complement or even replace legal systems, or even do a better job than legal systems can in protecting certain types of security, specifically transaction security. But at the same time, there are so many things that cannot be coded. There is this theory, it's called the theory of incomplete contracts in economics, which basically states that for many, if not most decisions, we can't have deterministic outcomes because the future states of the world are just so potentially so many, and we cannot possibly foresee all of them. So inevitably, you will need some interpretation when you set up rules, or you will need to set up some mechanism for resolving conflicts or disputes that come up in the future. So basically, it means that while we can try, and we should try to encode as many things as we can, we will never be able to encode the whole world or all types of human transactions, of business transactions, business decisions in smart contracts. Therefore, we inevitably need this element of governance, which helps us resolve conflicts, or even in the first place come up with business models that are more interesting than just money or just simple transactions.
I just had a flash when you said that the world cannot be, the code is law and it cannot be automated with all these frameworks. And it just had a flash that I hope one day AI is not going to take over the other portion. But that's a tangent. I wanted to just have a quick focus on security because you keep alluding to it. And how is it solved by Q protocol? Or how does the protocol remove the risk of blockchain governance exploits, for example, crypto ecosystems attacks, or any kind of theft that we have witnessed over the past, since the inception of crypto, but more recently, some of the big ones, the big thefts?
Mm-hmm. It's a system of checks and balances. So you have different stakeholders within the Q ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Maybe an important one, maybe the most important one, is an element that we call root nodes, which are full nodes in the system that are responsible for enforcing the Q constitution, and they can implement decisions or have things like veto rights on certain decisions based on the rule set or to which they are bound. So it's essentially it's humans at the end of the day. It's people or institutions that are selected according to specified criteria, ensuring competence but also independence. Mm-hmm. And they can support enforcement of decisions within the protocol, but also, as we say, integrated applications, so the ones that integrate with the Q protocol and have certain governance aspects enforced. But this is one element, but also the root nodes are then subject to checks and balances. So they need to put up stake in forms of Q tokens, which can be slashed in case that they go wrong or are corrupted. They are subject to the dispute resolution process within the Q protocol, meaning that if there are root node decisions with which the person or token holder that is affected by it is not happy or believes that the rules of the constitution were not applied correctly, they can initiate an arbitration procedure. Currently, there is the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce's Court of Arbitration, which is integrated into the protocol. Currently, we're integrating other arbitration options as well. And the token holders can choose the path of arbitration to contest decisions by root nodes or other stakeholders within the system on the basis that they're non-constitutional. And again, if there is an arbitral award coming out of those cases, that can then be enforced on chain. Mm-hmm. So there is a number of checks and balances, a couple of more without going into too much detail. But this concept or idea of checks and balances is an important one in the sense that no single stakeholder or stakeholder group should be able to corrupt the system.
So you mentioned Q tokens, which are the native assets of the Q blockchain. Maybe let's take a turn and talk about the technicals a bit, if you don't mind. What are the primary characteristics of the Q blockchain? Is it primarily a blockchain, or is it also an application-specific blockchain, etc.? Just if you can just let us in on the blockchain characteristics.
Yeah. On a technical level, the Q protocol is based on a layer 1 blockchain, which is based on a fork of the Geth client. So it's, if you want, it's based on Ethereum technology. So the proposition of Q as a protocol is not to be a better blockchain in the sense that maybe Solana or Avalanche or other contenders are trying to do. So it's not, if you will, competing on the basis of transaction speed or transaction cost. I think it's good on all of those metrics, but that's not really the rationale or the reason why Q as a protocol exists. So again, coming back to the technicalities, it's a layer 1 blockchain, fully EVM compatible. So anything that's running on Ethereum can easily be deployed on Q. But as I said, it's a separate blockchain on a technical basis. So in terms of transaction speed, transaction costs, I think everything is competitive So there is a 5-second block time, 5-second finality. Transaction costs are around 0.001 cent currently. But then again, that's not really the focus also of the team that's supporting the Q protocol. The focus is really to provide this element of shared governance security, which doesn't, or hasn't existed so far yet. And having a separate layer 1 blockchain is a means to providing that functionality.
What about the validators? How is the validation system set up in Q? Is it any different, or is there any just trying to gather information on how it's different than some of the other layer 1s?
Yeah, it's a delegated proof of stake system with in-protocol delegation, which I think has been kind of out of fashion, but actually becoming more popular again recently with the discussions, especially in Ethereum, about liquid staking and the consequences of that. So it's not, again, I don't think the validation part is spectacularly novel in Q. I think a couple of elements are actually interesting in that they do promote decentralization. So for me, the in-protocol delegation is a positive aspect because it does force delegators to think about risks, to do that due diligence on validators, to distribute tokens, and therefore promotes decentralization. Having said all that, one element which also is important in that aspect is that we have the second layer of nodes, the root nodes, which also control, in a sense, not control, that's the wrong word, but keep in check the validator set. So with even a relatively small validator set, I believe that the Q protocol, if you just purely look at it as a layer 1 blockchain, can achieve a high level of decentralization than other comparable blockchains, because you have this added element of the root node layer, which would need to be corrupted in addition to the validator layer to do things like double spend or censor certain transactions. Maybe just pointing out one.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, one element which I find increasingly interesting, also given the recent discussions around not only potential censoring on the Ethereum blockchain, but also things like restaking in the Ethereum ecosystem. And that is the concept of what we call constitutional slashing. So given that Q as a protocol is based on a constitution that defines the rules of the system, we're able to have to define responsibilities of validators that go beyond what you can detect on a purely technical level. And I think the most important case here is censoring of transactions. So censoring of transactions in Ethereum or on other L1 blockchains is very hard, if not impossible, to detect automatically purely, on a technical basis. Because it's very hard to prove that anyone consciously or was determined not to include certain transactions in a block. Because you have the mempool, and some transactions might simply not have reached the mempool of a specific validator. So therefore, in Ethereum, as in other L1s, you don't have slashing penalties for censoring of transactions. And you have this discussion around social slashing, which basically means that if censoring is detected by the community would need to get together and kind of in an undefined way coordinate around slashing specific validators or forking out specific validators. And within Q, given again that the rule set is based on the constitution and slashing is administered by the root nodes, that is something that we can have in protocol, which I think is very, very interesting, and hopefully we'll never need to make use of in the protocol, but is an element of additional security to prevent certain type of malicious behavior at the validator level.
What that's the slashing. It's I had a thought before that. I also read that DeFi comes natively on Q protocol. What exactly do you mean by that? Does that mean that it's embedded in the protocol itself? Or how is it that it comes natively? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, there is a DeFi system within Q that's been there from the very beginning. And that is what we call a fully integrated application, meaning that there is no separate governance token, and decision-making and governance of that DeFi protocol, which is essentially kind of a MakerDAO V1 clone, if you will, that is all integrated in the Q protocol. Now, that doesn't mean that this DeFi system or this element of DeFi, which is native to the Q protocol, is in any way exclusive, or that it's a preferred or recommended way to use Q. So Q as a protocol is completely permissionless. It's open, so anyone can deploy their own DeFi applications on Q. But it's kind of, I guess, a test case or proof of concept, maybe is a better word, for some of the governance features within Q. So things like parameter setting within that DeFi protocol, which is decentralized stablecoin, over collateralized, similar to MakerDAO, that has been there in the Q protocol from the start. So it's kind of demonstrating how the Q governance mechanisms can be used within DeFi systems.
Just curious, how long is mainnet running for? I mean, how long has Q been on mainnet?
Mainnet was launched in March 2022.
Oh, okay.
So for over 1.5 years.
And
the first...
Yeah. Go for
just the first year, I would say, or first maybe 9 months roundabout, were mainly used to build out the stakeholder base. So specifically root nodes. We started with 3 root nodes in the Genesis block, which were first run by the Q International Foundation, which is the entity that launched the protocol. Right now, there are 25 root nodes on 5 continents, and I believe today it's either 12 or 13 different jurisdictions, and that was built out during the first year of the protocol.
Okay.
And since pretty much, I would say this summer, protocols have started onboarding at a much greater speed on the Q protocol, and I guess it's different to many other launches of layer 1 protocols, in the sense that many of them have a testnet that's running. They're trying to onboard protocols to the testnet by incentivizing them to do so, and then kind of have a big bang launch. The reason why we did things differently within Q is that we felt that the governance framework and stakeholder base needed to be built out first before having meaningful protocols with value behind it on board onto Q, because it really is a security critical element, the whole governance aspect of Q. So I kind of grapple with the term governance experimentation, which is always often used. I think experimentation is fine as long as it doesn't involve real value. But as soon as it does, you should be beyond or the experimentation stage. So we try to really get a solid grounding on the governance framework, on the governance stakeholders that are involved, build it out, test it, have some cases within the Q protocol itself before being more public and having more protocols, external protocols on board onto Q.
Well, throughout the so-called governance experimentation, what would you say were your main learning lessons or key takeaways?
One is that designing a system that's coherent is not enough. You also need the participants to operate within the systems. So, as I said, the root nodes that we've built out over more than a year are a critical element. And all of those are experienced people and institutions that bring valuable skills to the Q protocol. Nevertheless, they need to be familiar with the Q constitution. They need to be familiar with the processes, both from a technical standpoint and a governance standpoint. And that takes time. Right. I mean, it's not like you can just, I mean, sometimes use the parallel or the analogy of countries that form newly and import legal systems. And we've had, unfortunate examples throughout the world where that's been the case, where new country formed and then came up with a new constitution, new set of laws. But just having those laws on paper just isn't enough. You need the people to actually live the laws. You need a culture to develop around those laws to make them work well. And if that doesn't happen, they will often have the opposite effect of being used as a facade to implement decisions that are actually not within the spirit of what was intended. And I think similarly on decentralized protocols, as soon as humans get involved, you need the culture to develop alongside with the formal rule set.
The culture?
Yes, the culture.
Sorry, I just didn't. Yeah, the culture. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you speak more about that in terms of what is the Q culture, or is there a Q culture? Would you say? Definitely.
It's a good question. I've never been asked to define it, so let me give it a try.
No, I mean it's wouldn't say. How do you see it? Maybe, or has it been an evolving culture? Because I'm sure the starting points have also been different than what you just mentioned. Sort of attracting and having participants. Also, who are all these participants? I mean, they all contribute and constitute the culture, but. I always find it interesting to hear. I mean, it may be just your perception, but it's not a static concept, right? Of culture, it's like an evolving.
Yeah,
it's an evolving phenomenon.
So, based on the history, also the way in which the protocol is set up, as well as the stakeholders that are participating. I would say, and I don't want to sound it like it's boring or not fun, but I would say there is awareness of the seriousness of what we're doing within the culture of the Q stakeholders.
Yes, so
it's I mean, we do have fun, we do enjoy ourselves, definitely, but I think the stakeholders that contribute to the Q ecosystem are very well aware of that, what we are doing, what they are doing, what the community is doing.
The purpose, right?
Has an impact, right? It affects potentially other people, other protocols that build on Q. So I would say there is an understanding of the seriousness that maybe is lacking in other ecosystems or other communities sometimes.
Sure. I don't think that's boring at all. I think that's actually it adds an element of credibility, right? I mean, just being part of. You previously mentioned that you covered 12 jurisdictions, so I sort of just automatically thought, okay, this is more of a global thing, that for one, but also the commitment and the dedication and the focus. I mean, it sounds maybe sort of cliche, but I think it's needed now more than ever, because just in general, the Web3 or crypto, or we use these terms interchangeably. So I'm considering that you think it's important that how we use our words. I wanted to ask you about that as well later, but I don't think it's boring at all, bottom line, in terms of the culture. And you definitely want to have your team members to know why they're there, right? To know what the purpose is.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe accountability is a term that comes in here. So again, I've never been asked the question, so trying to make up my mind here as I speak. But I think that the governance stakeholders are very well aware of what they're doing, and they feel accountable of what they're doing, which is something that maybe is sometimes lacking, as I said, in other ecosystems where people just more are in the experimentation stage and just think that this concept of move fast and break things, I think works in some areas. It definitely shouldn't be applied when it comes to governance decisions, as soon as they go beyond the trivial.
How big is the Q team? How many people do you have generally?
So always a difficult question because it depends on whom you count and how you count. So if you look at the core governance community, root nodes, as I said, 25 currently. There is Q Development, which is a Liechtenstein-based company, which is supporting the protocol, which has, I think, about probably something like 7 or 8 people working full time. But of course, then there is a much broader set of people working on the protocol, supporting the protocol, often part-time, often as contractors, or in parallel to supporting other protocols or working on other protocols. And I would say that probably something like 30 people on top of that I would consider to be very close to the protocol. And
is this more? Yeah. Okay. Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah. Just working actively on building elements of the protocol or very close to the protocol.
Are these mostly developers?
Well, probably 50-50, not entirely. So
not entirely.
Obviously,
okay,
there are a bunch of developers. Also, there are people with governance, more legal backgrounds. Also, people, like myself, I'm not a developer. I have a finance background. So things that I'm working on are concepts of how to evolve the protocol to be able to better and more easily integrate other protocols into the governance framework, provide easier access, provide frameworks around how that can be done for specific functions, for specific use cases. So also there are other people similar to me who don't necessarily have a technical or developer background, still work on developing elements of the protocol further.
So you just describe for us a bit what your role is as one of the co-initiators. Just curious, what's your... Well, I probably don't have a typical day. No one has a typical day in this space, but a roller coaster. But maybe a typical week, or maybe what are your typical days look? What do your typical days look like now?
You kind of
in this
already
space
gave the answer.
I already answered. It's not typical.
Which also makes it very interesting for me that I don't necessarily have typical days, but currently I'm working very closely with a small team of people where we are thinking about and developing concepts of how to provide tooling and potentially also evolve the protocol itself. So make proposals how the Q protocol could change in the future. That make it easier for other protocols to onboard and to use the Q governance architecture. And just trying to answer your question here. So typical day would be combination of talking to those people, in meetings, catching up on what they've been working on, what they are working, thinking myself about those concepts, writing things down, talking to developers, testing and checking how that can be implemented on a technical basis. But it's very much multidisciplinary. So, there is always the technical aspect. There is the legal or governance aspect. And of course, there is also the, if you want to call it that, the market aspect. So I also spend a fair amount of time talking to people who are engaged in other protocols and trying to find out what their pain points are and what we can do to address those pain points. So in terms of use cases, in terms of functional capabilities or elements of other projects and protocols, where is governance security needed? where does it provide the most value to other protocols or people building either on Q or even in other ecosystems.
So would you say that talking to other people who are into the governance framework realm, it sounds like this is a collaborative process? So it's not like Q is a closed thing and you guys are secretly doing what you're doing with your own recipe. It doesn't sound like it's a competitive, I don't know, I would say like a competitive, there's a competitive tone to it. If I understood it correctly, you're collaborating with other protocols that are also trying to tackle the governance framework.
Absolutely. And one of the...
Which is the way to go, by the way. Yeah. I mean, that's what... I mean, this is Web3, right? I mean, yeah, we say, we're all working on it together and it shouldn't be competitive. You know, I mean, there is that portion of it. But for this, it's important that it's not, right? Because just like what you said, from the ground up, it should be that just in general, the governance setup is critical. So figuring it out the right way, it sounds like it should be collaborative and inclusive.
Yes, yeah, I mean, absolutely. It cannot work if it's not, right? So, I mean, it's not like the Q protocol can impose anything on anyone else. Mm-hmm. People need to want to use what the Q protocol provides. Otherwise, it's not worth anything. Mm-hmm. So I think necessarily it's a collaborative process, but also, and it's not really, it's not hard also to consider it that way because there isn't really competition. I mean, it's such a new and, mm-hmm. in my view, underdeveloped area of Web3, mm-hmm. Maybe differently to some other areas. I mean, if you're working on a DeFi protocol, we're doing a DEX just on a different ecosystem, or we're doing a DEX or I don't know, decentralized protocol, which there are already 20 of, and we're trying to do little thing just a little bit better, mm-hmm. then maybe it's much more natural to develop that competitive feeling that you shouldn't collaborate, that you should be working against other protocols rather than collaborate with them, because there is so much out there. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to governance security, there isn't really much. So in that sense, it's not even a question. It's mm-hmm. But again, I think it's a necessity to be collaborative.
Absolutely. To what extent is the Q protocol active and in use? So in terms of people using Q or just by organizations that are using Q. To what extent, I mean, I'm just trying to, I don't know what the best, how to phrase the question, but yeah, I mean, to what extent are you active? I mean, who's approaching you? Or do you have a typical user, or do people approach you? Or do you find that you are approaching others? Or how does that process work on onboarding, I don't know, we should say potential clients or just users?
Yeah, right now, there are around, I believe it's something like 14 or 15 protocols mm-hmm.
That
we are working with that either already do or intend to use the governance features of Q. So as we say, opt into the governance features or integrate mm-hmm. with Q's governance features, meaning that those protocols also pay for the governance features. So similarly, like you would pay for gas fees on Ethereum, you pay governance fees on Q if you're integrating with Q and use those features. And currently, as I said, 14 or 15, I think it is.
14
protocols,
or 15, okay.
Yes, are doing that.
Okay.
It's still an early stage, I would say. Mm-hmm. And still onboarding is, for the most part, bespoke in the sense that there are no plug-and-play solutions yet, which is something, as I said earlier, that I'm working on together with a small team. But this is kind of where we're at in terms of protocol usage when it comes to the governance features of Q, which is the main differentiator of the Q protocol. And the way in which those protocols or projects learn about Q, I think, has been very much in the last few months. It has been people from the Q community approaching other people in other protocols or ecosystems. I think as the Q protocol grows, and this is what we are experiencing right now, we also have people that learn about the Q protocol and then actively approach someone within the ecosystem or from the core team.
I just by reading your website and the information about Q, just curious. So how are MIT and Deutsche Telekom and Greenfield Capital and all these big names supporting the project?
The ones that you mentioned, they are all active as root nodes. So Deutsche Telekom, Greenfield, they are there.
Is it University of Toulouse?
Yes, University of Toulouse. So it's not the university itself, to be precise. It's a professor, David Saland, who's a game theorist, who's acting as a root node. Yeah. So root node is one way to support. Also, Deutsche Telekom and Greenfield Capital. The two of them have participated in a token sale earlier, actually last year. So they've also invested in Q tokens, and Deutsche Telekom is also operating a validator node. So there are different ways in which they support it. I think the ones you mentioned, as I said, all run root nodes. There is some overlap between root nodes, validators, people in what we call expert panels, which is another type of governance stakeholder, which is more specialized compared to root nodes and taking care of decisions in certain functional areas. So it's a different element, but yeah, as I said, the ones that you've mentioned all are active as root nodes.
Okay. And how many co-initiators are there?
3. So
3, because it's you, yourself, and is
yes, Nicholas? And also Andre. And
there's one more.
Yes.
Okay. And are you more of the financial backbone or sort of the financial consultant backbone, considering that you've been in finance? And I would expect that I shouldn't say this, but more the skeptical one. I'm also an ex-finance person, and I'm a skeptical person. So
yeah, I definitely would agree. I'm very skeptical. At the same time, I can be very enthusiastic about things, but I'm very, which kind of is difficult sometimes, being both at the same time. But I'm skeptical. Yes, that's a fair statement. And I'm definitely the one who's naturally inclined to work on all the economics topics. Okay. Token design, incentive design. What's the motivation? What's the payoffs for different stakeholders? How they are aligned or not? Picking out agency conflicts within the ecosystem, trying to come up with ways to solve them.
Okay.
That's definitely something that's very much related to my finance background.
Sure. Would you say that there are many more prominent challenges within what you just mentioned? You talked about incentive design. It sounds exciting, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
How do you design an incentive? I mean, do you actually design? I mean, you're the sole sort of initiator of that. How do you go about designing the incentive system?
It's not a process that I could easily structure. So it's definitely be very iterative in the sense that we've been working on it before even starting programming anything, just coming up with different designs, different design options, weighing them against each other, writing things down, rewriting things. And of course, I think a large part is learning from other protocols. I mean, the people forget about that, but there have been many token designs even before Ethereum, even before DeFi existed.
Sure.
That went into these things. I mean, trying to learn from them, both the good parts and the bad parts where protocols failed, but also trying to learn from other areas. I mean, obvious one for me with a finance background is looking at corporate finance, trying to figure out what worked there, what doesn't, or what didn't. And just making improvements, step by step in an iterative process. That's the way that we've gone about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Martin, what lies ahead in terms of your roadmap, or can you let us in on sort of the short term for year end 2023 and what lies ahead further in 2024?
Short term or short and medium term is definitely onboarding existing protocols that are already either on queue or want to onboard onto queue, and supporting them with governance integration. And following from that, learning what protocols actually need, what works, what is helpful, and trying to modularize these things into almost like APIs, I guess. That's kind of the vision, to make it easier for protocols to onboard onto queue and to use queue to protect governance security. That is something, as I said, that I'm working on these days. Maybe following on from that, which is maybe a little bit more long-term, but I think also moving very fast, is the topic of cross-chain governance. Currently, to use Queue's governance features, you would still need to build on Queue natively as a layer 1. I believe that adding the ability for protocols that don't live on Queue, but that natively are on other chains, to use Queue's governance features is very valuable. And I've just come back from DevConnect in Istanbul. I mean, there was a lot of talk about cross-chain governance. So I think it's an area where we're moving fast. Some of people within the Queue ecosystem have started researching on that. We do have some projects with other protocols where we're already figuring out first prototypes. So being able to expand what Queue as a protocol can offer beyond the native Queue blockchain is one area of research and work that we're very keen on. Well,
it's actually, it sounds exciting.
It is.
So no, I'm being serious.
It's near
cross-chain governance. Then that's sort of the next
next frontier. Yeah.
What you're moving on to next.
Yeah.
Next frontier. Actually, that's a good one. Well, Martin, I mean, I just noticed we've been talking for a little over an hour. I think we've covered some extensive. Well, you've covered some extensive ground very nicely for us. Is there anything that I have not asked that maybe you wanted to share, or that I should have asked in our conversation, throughout our conversation?
I don't think so. No, I think you've touched on really a lot of very relevant topics. So I don't have anything to add right now.
Yeah, I think, the purpose is sort of setting the stage, getting a little bit more into what governance frameworks, what does it all mean, right? And what Queue is doing. There's a transactional part, and then there's obviously the governance part, which is the purpose. So, well, this has been a great conversation. I really thank you so much for your time. I've actually learned a great deal just by listening to you, and I did some preliminary research, but obviously it sinks in much more when you actually talk about it. What would be the best way to follow your work or contact and of course, or maybe participate, if you could just share with our audience?
Best place to start is probably the website for the Queue protocol, which is run by Queue Development. The company website is simple. It's queue.org.
Okay.
And from there on, you'll find links to all the socials. So Twitter or Discord. Discord is a place where a lot of the conversation is happening. And you'll also be easily able to get in touch with, members of the community, team members, no matter whether it's specific questions around what Queue can do for other protocols, but also just general questions around Queue. Twitter, Discord. You'll find all the links via queue.org.
The usual. Okay, great. Yeah, we will include all that information in our show notes. So on that note, Martin, thanks so much for talking with me today and giving our audience, like I mentioned, a better understanding of Q and its governance framework, which, as you illustrated, goes beyond the code is law mantra of automation. It's important to take this into account as we continuously strive to improve the concept of Web3 and just in general governance. So I wish you and your team all the best. Good luck. And perhaps we can have you on our podcast at some later time and talk about cross-chain governance.
Thank you, Nina. It was fun. Thanks a lot for having me.
Sure thing. Thank you. Thanks again to our guests, and thank you everyone for listening. Thanks also to the Bariam Music team for providing their music. You can check them out on bariammusic.com. The episode supporting information is on our website, blockchainrecorded.com. Our podcast is available on Google, Apple, and Amazon Podcasts, as well as on YouTube, Spotify, and Radio Public. You can follow us on Twitter at Recorded Podcast and YouTube, where we are super grateful for your support. Stay tuned for our next episode.